In a drawer, in a dead man's house in San Francisco, in the spring of 1883, there was a small curl of hair tied with thread, and a label written in a careful hand. By the accounts that have come down from the estate, it read, "A lock of dear Florence's hair for her dear papa." The man was worth $4 million. He had died without a will, and with no family anywhere in America. And Florence, the child named on that label, was a girl in Manchester, in England, an ocean away, who did not yet know that her father was dead, that 129 strangers were already swearing under oath that they were his true heirs, and that 3 separate women had each come forward to claim they were his widow. She was not the only child a great fortune had tried to forget. She was only the one who came back and took all of it. Behind every marble facade of that gilded century, there was a name that someone had paid to erase. Before the first will is read, let me ask one small thing of you. If you love the stories the great fortunes tried to bury, subscribe and stay close, because over the next few hours these buried children come back one at a time, and not one of them arrives quietly. Chapter 1. A fortune keeps a second set of books. The Gilded Age built its fortunes in daylight and its families in the dark, and the border between the two was patrolled by money. In the parlours and the ballrooms, in the newspapers that printed the guest lists at Newport and the wedding presents on Fifth Avenue, the great American families presented a single clean surface, a lineage as tidy as a bank ledger, husband and wife and legitimate heirs arranged in a row. Underneath that surface, in a great many of those families, there was a hidden ledger. On those hidden pages were the entries no one was meant to read, the ones written in a smaller hand and kept out of sight, the discarded first loves, the servant girls, the actresses and shop girls and mistresses, and the children born to them. A rich man could not always control who was born. What he could control, or believed he could, was whether that birth ever became a fact the world was required to notice. The instrument he used was money, and the goal of the money was silence. A settlement, quietly paid. A lying-in home in another city, where a pregnancy could be carried to term behind a false name. A foundling asylum that would take an infant and ask very few questions. A train ticket, a new surname, a stipend that arrived so long as the recipient stayed away and stayed quiet. It was a whole economy of disappearance, and it ran on the same fortunes that built the mansions. The child was an entry in the second ledger of names, an account the family believed it had settled, closed, and could forget. But an account can be reopened, and this is the thing the great fortunes never fully reckoned with. A sum of money, once paid, is gone and silent. A child is not a sum of money. A child grows. A child can learn to read, and can read the letters a father sent, and can keep them. A child can grow into a woman who hires a lawyer, or a man who walks into a courtroom, or a grown daughter who crosses an ocean with a lock of her own hair and a father's careful handwriting on the label. The buried entry, in other words, could get up off the page and walk back into the room and stand at the reading of the will and ask to be paid. The walk back was hard, and when it succeeded, it was total, and the reasons lie in the machinery of the age. There was, first, no science of fatherhood. Blood typing lay decades in the future, and the double helix further still. Paternity in the 1800s was not a matter of biology, but of documents and witnesses and reputation. And the scale was weighted heavily toward the man. His word, backed by his standing and his lawyers, counted for a great deal. A poor woman's word, backed by nothing, counted for very little. In that imbalance, one kind of evidence outweighed almost all others, and that was acknowledgement on paper. A letter in the father's hand, an adoption instrument he had signed, a record of support sent faithfully across the years. If a woman or a child could produce the written name, the thing the father had committed to paper in an unguarded or a tender moment, the scale could tip. If she could not, it almost never did. Florence Blythe won $4 million because her father wrote it down. Alice Hartley lost the only thing she ever truly fought for because the man she loved would not. That single difference, a name set down or a name withheld, decides nearly every story in this account, and it repays holding on to as the cases accumulate. Watch, in each of them, for the piece of paper. Watch for who has it and who does not, for the letter kept in a drawer, the acknowledgement refused in a Reno bedroom, the asylum register, the forged page torn from a Bible. The fortunes are enormous, and the scandals are lurid, but underneath the marble and the blood, the contest is always the same narrow one, fought over a single sheet, whether a child's name was ever truly written down by the one person whose writing the law would honour. There was, second, the shadow system that made the erasing possible, a loose and semi-formal network of maternity homes, foundling asylums, and infant brokers that existed in part precisely to make the children of the powerful disappear. A young woman in trouble could be sent away to bear her child among strangers, and the child could be surrendered to an institution, and the institution could pass that child along, and at every step the paper trail thinned. It was designed to run in one direction, toward silence. But a system built to make children vanish could also, in the right unscrupulous hands, be made to run backward, to produce a child where none had been, an infant obtained and passed off as an heir. Both directions appear in the stories that follow, the same asylums and the same brokers, erasing a congressman's children in one case and supplying a Hamilton's false one in another. There was, third and last, the narrow ground on which a woman could stand and fight at all. She lived under coverture and its long shadow, with almost no direct legal power over a wealthy man. But the law left her two blunt instruments. One was the suit for breach of promise of marriage, which allowed a woman who had been promised a wedding and then abandoned to drag the private betrayal into open court and ask a jury to price it. The other was the contest of a will, the challenge a claimed heir could bring against an estate, forcing a probate court to decide, in public, whether the connection was real. Neither instrument was subtle. Both worked by exposure, by turning a family's carefully guarded secret into testimony read aloud in a crowded room, and by letting the one thing the dynasties could not fully control, scandal, do the work the law otherwise would not. Set one more fact beside these. The fortunes at the center of this story were, most of them, new. They had been made in a single lifetime, in railroads and silver and sewing machines and Manhattan land, by men who had climbed fast and far from origins they preferred not to discuss. A new fortune is a nervous fortune. It has no centuries of settled respectability to absorb a scandal, and it remembers, because it cannot help remembering, the messier life that came before the money. The bigger and the newer the fortune, the more it had to lose from a buried child, and the harder it would spend to keep that child buried. And the woman on the other side of that spending had almost nothing. Under the long shadow of coverture, she could own little in her own name, sue for little, and keep little that a powerful man wished to take. She entered every one of these fights already behind, which is why, when she won at all, the winning was so extraordinary. So keep the image of that second set of books. 6 times over the pages that follow, an entry the family thought was closed will get up and walk back into the room. 6 times a name that money had struck out will demand to be written back in. Some of the children were real, and one of them will take everything. Some of the children were invented, and by the end, you will see grown strangers by the thousand manufacturing a secret child out of nothing at all, because by then, the buried heir had become the most valuable thing a person could pretend to be. It begins with the man who kept not one hidden family, but 5, and hid them so well that they only met each other over his coffin. Chapter 2. The sewing machine hid 5 families. The machine that stitched the clothing of the 19th century belonged to a man who kept everyone in his life apart. His name was Isaac Merritt Singer, and by the time he died, he was one of the first truly self-made American fortunes. A man who had climbed out of an itinerant and hard-scrabble youth into wealth, on a scale the old families still found vulgar. He was enormous, well over 6 feet, theatrical by training and temperament, a former traveling actor who never quite stopped performing. And the performance that mattered most, the one he sustained for decades and across 2 continents, was the management of the families he was not supposed to have. Singer did not invent the sewing machine. What he did, in 1850 and the year that followed, was redesign it into something practical, a machine an ordinary household could actually use, and then, with his partner Edward Clark, build around it the aggressive apparatus of patents and installment selling that turned a good device into an empire. The Singer machine went into parlors and workrooms on both sides of the Atlantic. It became, for millions of families, the most complicated and expensive thing they owned. A piece of furniture that promised order, the neat joining of one piece of cloth to another. The irony sat at the center of the man's life, like a stone. The device that joined things together made the fortune of a man who spent his private life keeping people from ever meeting. Consider the arithmetic of it, because the arithmetic is the scandal. Over the course of his life, Isaac Singer fathered at least 24 children, and by some counts as many as 26. He fathered them on 5 different women, and for long stretches he ran several of those families at once, in different households, under different names, with each family kept in ignorance of the others. This was not a man with a single secret. This was a man who had industrialized the secret, who applied to his private life the same genius for parallel production that he applied to his factories. The scale of the enterprise that paid for all this concealment is worth holding in the mind, because the size of the fortune is the size of the secret it could hide. The Singer machine was not a luxury for the few. It went into ordinary homes by the hundreds of thousands, sold on the installment plan that Singer and his partner Edward Clark had pioneered, a few dollars down and a few dollars a month, so that a working family could own the most complicated mechanism it would ever touch. The company's agents spread across the country and then across the world. The money came back in a steady flood, and it built, by the end, an estate reckoned at some $13 million, a sum that in the money of the present would run into the hundreds of millions. It was a fortune large enough to keep several households at once and never feel the cost, large enough that a man could afford, quite literally, to be several men. And several men is very nearly what he was. In one household, he was the devoted Mr. Merritt, husband and father. In another, he was Mr. Matthews, the same in every particular except the name and the family. He moved between these lives with the practiced ease of the actor he had trained to be, keeping each audience persuaded that the performance it saw was the whole of the man. It is the theatrical instinct turned to a domestic purpose. The traveling player who had learned to become a different person in a different town, now becoming a different father in a different house, and sustaining the roles not for an evening, but for decades, until only death could bring the whole cast on stage at once. With his first legal wife, Catherine Haley, whom he married as a very young man, he had 2 children, William and Lillian. That marriage did not so much end as get buried under everything that came after. For while he was still married to Catherine, Singer took up with a woman named Mary Ann Sponsler and lived with her, and presented her to the world as his wife for the better part of 2 decades, and had with her 10 children, of whom 8 would live to see his fortune. To move through the world with Mary Ann, he used a stage name lifted from his own middle name. In hotels and on leases, they were Mr. and Mrs. Merritt. His own child would later carry that invented surname into the record, a family named after a lie their father told to hide them. And Mary Ann, who believed herself the true partner, the woman at the centre, did not know that a short distance away Singer was keeping another household entirely. There he lived with a woman named Mary McGonigal, who had worked for him, and there he fathered roughly 5 more children, of whom 2 died. Those children were entered in the world under yet another false name, Matthews. Not Singer, never Singer. The surname itself was the erasing, a mask fitted onto a child at birth, so that the child could grow up a short carriage ride from a father worth millions and never be permitted to bear his name. There was a further woman still, Mary Eastwood Walters, and a daughter by her, Alice, brought into the world under the Merritt alias as well. And there would be, at the end, a glamorous younger third legal wife, Isabella Boyer, and 6 more children by her, one of whom, a daughter named Winaretta, would grow up to become a princess in Paris, and one of the great musical patrons of her age, the gilded afterlife of a fortune whose foundation was concealment. There is something almost systematic in the cruelty of it, the way each hidden family was fitted with a name that was not its own. The children Mary Ann bore him went into the world as little Merritts, after a stage name their father had worn in his acting days. The children of Mary McGonigal went as Matthewses. Neither set was permitted the name Singer, the name on the machine in half the parlours of the nation, the name that meant money. A child could grow up within a short carriage ride of a father worth millions, could perhaps even see the Singer name stamped on a neighbour's sewing machine, and never be told that the name belonged to him. The false surname was the whole apparatus of erasure fitted onto a child at the very moment of birth, a lie the child would wear for as long as the father could enforce it. Hold the whole picture in your mind for a moment, because it is the pattern this entire story turns on, drawn once in its largest and simplest form. A single man, so wealthy that he could afford to keep entire duplicate families, each in its own house, each under its own invented name, each kept carefully ignorant of the others, all of them orbiting a fortune none of them could openly claim. The children of Mary Ann under the name Merritt, the children of Mary McGonigal under the name Matthews. Real people, living real childhoods, who were in the eyes of the law very nearly no one, because the one document that would have made them their father's heirs, the acknowledgement of his name, had been deliberately withheld and replaced with a fiction. They owned nothing. They were owed everything. And the only event that could ever force the question into the open was the one event Isaac Singer could not stage manage or postpone, which was his own death. That reckoning was coming. But before the will, there was the moment the whole fragile architecture of secrecy cracked in public for the first time. And it cracked, as these things so often did, not in a courtroom, but on a New York street. Chapter 3. The will read out the price of loyalty. When Isaac Singer died in 1875 at Paynton, in Devon, in the west of England, his will did not so much divide a fortune as expose a life. But the exposure had begun years earlier, and it began with Mary Ann Sponsler, the woman who had given him a decade of children under a borrowed name and believed she was his wife. The discovery, when it came, was the ordinary and terrible one. Mary Ann learned that the man she thought of as her husband was keeping the second household, the Matthews family, another woman, and another set of his children living a short distance from her own. The performance of a single devoted life collapsed in an instant into the truth of parallel ones. There was a public confrontation, reported in the papers of the day, a scene in the open street involving a carriage, the kind of scene the tabloids of the era lived for. A mistress and a wife and a great man's dignity all coming apart at once. The papers of the day carried the spectacle, because a spectacle was exactly what it was: the private architecture of a great man's double life spilling into a New York street in front of anyone who cared to watch. For Mary Ann, it was the end of an illusion she had lived inside for the better part of 2 decades. The discovery that the devotion she thought was hers had been divided all along, portioned out to a second household she had never known existed. The betrayal was legal as much as personal, and she understood the difference. A wronged mistress had no standing. A wronged wife had a great deal. And so her grief hardened into a claim, and the claim went to the one place where a woman of her position could still make a rich man flinch, which was the criminal law. And Mary Ann did the thing that a discarded woman was told she must never do. She went to the law. She had Isaac Singer arrested for bigamy. The charge was not one a man of his wealth intended to answer. In 1862, Singer did what such men could do, and poorer men could not. He left. He fled the country for Europe, and he stayed away, and in time he settled in the west of England and married Isabella and began the last of his families in a kind of gilded exile. The arrest never became a reckoning. It simply chased him across an ocean, and the question it raised, whether Mary Ann had ever truly been his wife, went with him, unanswered, waiting. It waited 13 years, until the will. And the will, when it was opened, turned out to be the hidden ledger made suddenly legible, every hidden family named at last on a single page, and beside each name, a number that told them exactly what their father had thought they were worth. The estate was reckoned at some $13 million, a fortune of a size that in the money of today would run to the hundreds of millions. For 13 years, the question of his marriages had hung unanswered in the air between 2 continents, and the will did not answer it so much as monetize it. Every hidden family Singer had ever kept was named at last on the pages of that document, and beside each name stood a figure, and the figures did the confessing the man had spent his life avoiding. A reader who knew nothing of Isaac Singer could reconstruct from the will alone the whole secret architecture of his affections, which household he had favoured, which woman he had feared, which child he had meant to punish. He had hidden his families in life behind aliases and oceans. In death, he laid every one of them out in a single column of numbers. Singer divided it, and he divided it unequally, and the inequality was itself a kind of confession. By the reported accounts of the contest and the settlement, the 8 surviving children of Mary Ann Sponsler, the Merritt children, shared around $1,750,000 among them. The children of Mary McGonigal, the Matthews children, hidden under the falsest name of all, were to share a nearly identical sum, about $1,750,000. The daughter Alice, by Mary Walters, was left something on the order of $400,000. The bulk of the remainder went to Isabella, the last wife, and her children, the family Singer had lived with openly at the end. So far, the will reads as the cool arithmetic of a man dividing a fortune among the children he had chosen, in life, to keep. And then there is the single cruelest line in the document. William, the eldest son, the child of the first legal wife, the boy from the marriage that all the later secrets had buried, had made one choice in his life that his father could not forgive. He had taken his caste off mother's side. He had stood with Catherine against the man who displaced her. And so, from a fortune of $13 million, from a father who handed out inheritances in the hundreds of thousands to the children of his aliases, William Singer received $500. His sister Lillian received $10,500, set down in a rich man's will beside a loyal son's name, is not an oversight. It is a sentence. It is the price a father put on a son's loyalty to a discarded mother, spelled out to the dollar, so that the boy would understand exactly what the loyalty had cost him. The will, read this way, is less an accounting than a map of a man's loves and his grudges disguised as arithmetic. Every figure in it is a judgment. The hundreds of thousands to the children of the aliases record which secret families Singer had chosen, in the end, to honor. The $500 to William records the one loyalty he could not forgive. A fortune, at the moment of death, becomes the truest confession its owner ever makes, because the dead cannot pretend, and the numbers cannot soften, which names the man had decided were worth something, and which he had decided were worth almost nothing at all. Mary Ann Sponsler did not accept the arithmetic. She contested the will, and the heart of her contest was the question the bigamy charge had raised and never settled, the question of the name set down in ink. She set out to prove that she had been Singer's lawful wife, that in the years after his divorce from Catherine and before her own later remarriage, there had been, in fact and in law, a marriage between them. It was not a sentimental claim. It was the most practical claim in the world. If she could establish the marriage, her children stopped being the offspring of a mistress and became the legitimate heirs of a wife, and their standing and their share changed with them. Her whole fight came down to whether the connection had ever been written into the law or only lived in fact. It is the exact hinge, drawn here at the very start, on which every case in this story turns. Was the buried family real in the eyes of the law, or only real in the world? Singer had spent a lifetime and a false surname making sure the answer stayed no. His widow, at the reading of the will, was trying to force it to yes. The Singer children fought over what a dead man's fortune had already granted them, more or fewer of the hundreds of thousands, a name restored or withheld. It was a fight conducted among heirs, over a table already laid. Other women would not be so lucky. The next one in this account would have no fortune at her back and no share waiting to be argued over. She would have only a child, and a demand that a powerful man put a single line in writing, and when he refused her, she would answer him with a revolver, and she would still, in the end, lose. Chapter 4. She wanted the child's name in writing. In Reno, in 1894, a woman with no money and a senator's child asked for the one thing he would never give her. Her name was Alice Maud Hartley. She had been born in England, and she came to Nevada as a widow, a woman of some refinement and no fortune, an artist by inclination, set down in a raw silver and cattle state where money and power were held by a small circle of men, and the law belonged to them. Reno in the 1890s was a small and a hard place, a railroad and mining town on the edge of the Nevada desert, where a handful of men held the banks, the offices, and the levers of the law between them. Murray Foley was one of that handful. To be the president of the Bank of Reno and a member of the state senate in a town that size was to be very near the top of everything, to be a man whose word moved money and whose reputation the whole apparatus of the place was arranged to protect. A woman like Alice Hartley, English-born, widowed, without family or fortune in the territory, stood at the opposite pole of that same small world. Whatever passed between them passed between two people, as unequal in power as two people in a single town could be. Into that inequality came the pregnancy, and with it, the only leverage a woman in Alice Hartley's position could ever hope to hold over a man in Murray Foley's. She could not take him to a bank or to a ballot. or to any table where the powerful of Reno decided things among themselves. But she could carry his child, and a child was a fact that even a bank president could not simply vote out of existence, provided, and only provided, that the connection could be made to stick. And the way to make it stick, the only way, was to get the father to say so in his own hand. Everything Alice Hartley did afterward, the demand, the refusal, the shot, the trial, the suit, flowed from that single hinge, the acknowledgement she needed, and he would not give. Into that circle she was drawn by one man in particular, and his name was Murray Foley. Foley was as close to an aristocrat as Reno had. He was the president of the Bank of Reno, and he was a state senator, and his estate, when the accounting finally came, would be reported at somewhere between $2 and $8 million, the width of that range, a fair measure of how carefully the true figure was kept. He was, in the small world of Nevada, one of the men the machinery of the age was built to protect. Alice Hartley was exactly the kind of woman it was built to erase. What passed between them, she would later lay out in a courtroom, and her account was stark. She said that Foley had come to her with drugged brandy and Benedictine, that the drink had been used to overcome her, and that from that encounter she had become pregnant. Set the truth or the doubt of that account aside for a moment, because the part that matters most for this story is not the seduction, but what she demanded afterward. Alice Hartley did not ask Murray Foley for money. She did not ask him for marriage, or for a house, or for a stipend. She asked him for a sentence. She demanded that he acknowledge the paternity of the child and that he put it in writing. It is a demand that repays a moment's thought, because in its plainness it holds everything this whole account is about. A promise spoken in a private room could be denied the next morning, and no one could prove it had ever been made. A sum of money quietly handed over bought a season of comfort and no security at all. But a line of a father's own writing, admitting that the child was his, was a different order of thing entirely. It would outlive the quarrel that produced it. It would outlive the man who wrote it. It would follow the child into any courtroom in the country and speak on his behalf when both his parents were dust. Alice Hartley, who had no money and no standing and no power, read the machinery of her age precisely, and she reached past everything it offered her for the one thing that would actually hold. Understand what she was asking for, because it is the whole machinery of the age reduced to a single sheet of paper. She was not asking for love, which the law did not recognize, or for a promise, which a man could always deny. She was asking for the one form of evidence that outweighed a rich man's word, the acknowledgement in his own hand, the acknowledgement on paper. She understood, this Englishwoman with no fortune and no standing, exactly what would protect her child and exactly what would not. A private assurance was worth nothing. A verbal promise would evaporate the moment it became inconvenient. But a line in Foley's handwriting, admitting the child was his, would follow the child into any courtroom in the country and speak for him after both his parents were gone. She wanted the account entered in the open books, once, permanently, in ink. And that was the one thing Murray Foley would not do. A banker and a senator understood the name on paper as well as she did, understood it perhaps better, because he had spent a career watching what documents could do. He may have acknowledged the child in private, with a look or a word or a quiet sum. He would not acknowledge the child on paper. The very thing that would have secured the boy was the thing his position could not survive, and so it was refused. And the refusal is the void at the center of this story. In the Singer case, the admission in a father's own hand was hidden inside a false surname. Here it simply never existed at all, a blank sheet where a father's admission should have been, and around that blank sheet, everything that followed would turn. And there is a further turn in it, quiet and strange, that the record simply leaves standing. The son at the center of the fight, the child whose paternity Foley would not commit to paper, had not yet been born when the events that would decide his life were already over. He would come into the world in the November of that year, after his father was already in the ground and his mother already answering for the death. He would be, from his first breath, an heir to a fortune whose owner was dead, and a stranger to a father who had refused to name him even in life. A child born after the father he would inherit from was already gone is the kind of fact the machinery of the age produced without noticing, and it sits at the center of this story like a cold stone. She bore the child, a son, born on the 16th of November, 1894, and she named him Vernon Harrison Hartley. But the boy came into the world after the events that would define his short life had already happened, because by the time he was born, his father was already dead, and his mother was already facing trial for the killing. The child born into that wreckage cannot be understood without the night the previous July to a room in Reno, and to the single moment in which Alice Hartley stopped asking Murray Foley for anything and made him answer her in the only language he could no longer overrule. Chapter 5. A pardon, an estate, and a small coffin. When Murray Foley came to her room on the night of the 26th of July, 1894, the encounter turned violent, and Alice Hartley answered him with the only argument he could not appeal. She shot him. She shot the president of the Bank of Reno, a sitting state senator, one of the most powerful men in Nevada, and he died, and she was taken to answer for it. She was pregnant with his child as she waited for her trial. The killing of Murray Foley was not the act of a woman with options. It was the act of a woman at the end of them. She had asked for the acknowledgement on paper and been refused. She had carried the child of a man who would not own it. And on that July night, when the encounter in her room turned to violence, the revolver was the only thing in her possession that a senator could not overrule. The one argument in the whole unequal contest between them that did not depend on his signature, his standing, or his word. She used it, and a powerful man was dead, and the machinery of the state that had been built to protect him now turned, as it was designed to, upon her. The case that followed was, on its surface, a simple one of a woman who had killed a prominent man, and the machinery of the state moved to convict her. It did convict her. Alice Hartley was found guilty of murder in the second degree, and the jury attached to that verdict a recommendation of mercy, and she was sentenced to 11 years. The child, Vernon, was born into this, a boy whose first months were spent with a mother under sentence for the death of his father. And here the story might have ended, a woman erased more completely than any settlement could manage, buried in a prison cell while her son was raised by strangers. It did not end there, because the recommendation of mercy was a crack in the machinery, and public sympathy widened it. The facts of the case, as they became known, did not read like the facts the prosecution had needed. They read like the story of a woman wronged by a powerful man and left with the consequences. In January of 1897, the Nevada Board of Pardons took up her case, and it did a remarkable thing. It pardoned her. And in doing so, it made a finding, in the plain public language of the state, that turned the whole moral account upside down. The board found that Foley had wronged her. It found that she had a child to raise. The very institution of the state that had convicted her of his murder now recorded, as the reason for her freedom, that the dead senator had been the author of her ruin, and that a living child depended on her. There is a bitter symmetry in where that acknowledgement finally came from. Alice Hartley had begged the child's own father to admit paternity on paper, and he had refused her to his last breath. And now, years later, it was the state of Nevada that set the admission down, not in a father's tender hand, but in the cold language of a pardon board, recording as the official reason for a woman's freedom that the man she killed had wronged her and that his child needed raising. The nearest thing the boy would ever have to a father's acknowledgement was issued by the government that had convicted his mother of the father's murder. The word she had wanted so badly arrived at last, in the wrong hand, too late to do the child any good. It was as close to an acknowledgement of the boy's paternity as any official body would ever put on paper, and it came, with a bitter irony, from a pardon board rather than from the father's own hand. Free and vindicated in the eyes of the state that had jailed her, Alice Hartley did the thing this whole account is built around. She came back at the estate. She sued the fortune of the man she had killed, on behalf of the child he had refused to name, for half of everything he left. It was an audacious and a desperate act. A pardoned woman walking into court to claim a share of the millions of the senator she had shot, and she very nearly won it. A jury took up the question of whether Vernon Hartley was entitled to a portion of his father's estate, and that jury, by the reported count, split 8-4 in her favour. 8 of 12, ready to write the boy back into the fortune that had been built to keep him out. She was, for a moment, closer than any woman in this story, except one to forcing the account to be paid. Think of how narrow that was. 8 of the 12 citizens in that jury box were prepared to reach into a dead senator's fortune and set aside a share of it for the son he had refused to name. 2 more, and the boy would have been written back into the money that had been arranged to keep him out. It was the closest any of the wronged women in this account would come to the outright victory that only Florence Blythe achieved, and it failed not on the merits, not on the evidence, but on the frailty of a small child's body in an age before the fevers of childhood could be cured. And then the story closed in the cruelest way it could. The child died. Vernon Harrison Hartley, the boy who was the entire claim, the sole reason his mother had standing to touch $1 of the Foley estate, took scarlet fever and did not survive it. And with the child went the case, instantly and completely, because the law's logic was as cold as the machinery that had made the whole tragedy possible. Alice Hartley's claim on the estate existed only through her son. A judge ruled that with the boy gone, she was, in the language of the court, not of interest to the estate. Not of interest. A mother who had borne a senator's child, demanded his name in writing, killed him, gone to prison, won a pardon, and very nearly won the fortune, was told in the end that she was no one, because the one person who connected her to the money was in a small coffin. The logic that undid her was the same logic that ran through every erasure in this account, followed to its coldest conclusion. A woman's claim on a fortune existed only through the child who carried the blood. Take the child away, and the claim did not weaken, it simply ceased to exist, as though the mother had never had any part in the story at all. Alice Hartley had killed for her son's future and gone to prison for it, and won a pardon for it, and very nearly won a fortune for it. And in the space of a single fever, she was returned to exactly the nothing she had started from. She had spent everything she had, and the account was closed against her by the death of the only creditor the law would recognize. She had asked, at the very beginning, for a single line in writing, and she had never gotten it. She died a few years later, in 1907, having outlived both the man who refused her and the child who was her only claim against him. Alice Hartley lost because her children died young and the law recognized nothing else. But the next woman in this account also lost her children, both of them, to the same shadow system of asylums and lying in homes that ran beneath the whole gilded surface. The difference is that she did not answer the man with a revolver. She answered him in a courtroom in front of the entire country, and she made a 100-year-old dynasty pay. Chapter 6. 2 children vanished into the asylums. Madeline Pollard was about 17 when she met the silver-tongued colonel on a train, and a lifetime older than that in the judgment of men she would earn over the next 9 years. The train was travelling through Kentucky in the spring of 1884. The man across from her was William Campbell Preston Breckinridge, and to understand what it meant for a young woman of no particular family to fall under his attention, you have to understand what the name Breckinridge meant in America. It was one of the great political dynasties of the Republic. He was the grandson of a man who had served as Attorney General under Thomas Jefferson. His kin had sat in the cabinet and stood a heartbeat from the presidency. He himself was a congressman, an orator of such polished power that the newspapers called him the silver-tongued Breckinridge, a celebrated orator whose voice was among the most admired in the public life of his day. That contrast is not incidental, because it is the gap that would in the end undo him. Breckinridge was a public man of the highest standing, a celebrated orator whose whole authority rested on the trust of the people who returned him to office, even as he conducted, across 9 years, the ruin of a girl young enough to be his daughter. The distance between the public rectitude and the private conduct was enormous, and for a long time it did not matter at all, because the age granted a great man that distance as a matter of course. It would matter at the last, only because Madeline Pollard chose to close it in public. He was married. He was long established in public life and in the appearance of rectitude. And he was, in private, exactly the kind of powerful man the machinery of the age existed to protect. What began on that train lasted 9 years, and across those 9 years, Madeline Pollard bore him at least 2 children. And the fate of those children is the machinery of erasure working at its most institutional and its most complete. The first child was born on the 29th of May, 1885, and was placed in a foundling asylum in Ohio, far from Washington and far from the Breckinridge name. The second was born on the 3rd of February, 1888, and lived roughly 2 months before it died. A third pregnancy, years later, ended in a miscarriage on the 24th of May, 1893. 2 children born and surrendered, both dead. A third lost before its birth. This was the harvest of the affair, and it was disposed of through exactly the shadow system described at the outset. The lying in homes and the foundling asylums and the quiet institutional hands that existed to take the inconvenient children of powerful men and make them disappear. The institutions that swallowed the Pollard children were part of a vast and mostly invisible system that the respectable world preferred not to examine too closely. Foundling asylums and lying in homes existed in every city of any size, taking in the infants that could not be acknowledged, the children of servants and seamstresses and seduced girls, and the occasional child of a congressman. Mortality inside them was appalling. An infant surrendered to such a place entered a current that carried a great many of its passengers to early graves, and everyone who used the system knew it. To place a child in a foundling asylum in that era was very often to consign it, and the men who sent the children of their affairs into that current were not ignorant of where the current led. The testimony that would later be read aloud in court laid out how it was done, and the doing was the erasure in its purest procedural form. Breckinridge, by the account that emerged, compelled her to leave the infants in the asylums. The children were not merely born in secret. They were placed, deliberately, into the institutional current that carried such children away from their fathers' lives forever, entered on the rolls of a foundling home where a congressman's blood became just another anonymous entry in a ledger of the abandoned. There was no false surname here, as there had been with Singer, because there was no need of one. The asylum itself was the false name. It took a child with a place in one of America's first families and made of it a foundling with no name at all. Set beside that, the arithmetic of what Madeline Pollard had given and been given across those 9 years, because the imbalance is the whole moral of it. She had given her youth, from 17 onward. She had given 2 live births and a miscarriage. She had given up 2 children to institutions and then buried the knowledge of them. And in return, she had been given a promise, repeated and renewed, that when the colonel's wife was gone, he would at last make Madeline his own. That promise was the only asset she held. She had no money, no family power, no written name, nothing but a great man's word that one day the arrangement would be made right. The thinness of that asset is the whole trap. A promise of future marriage was, in law and in life, almost nothing. It could not be spent. It could not be recorded. It could be renewed for years and then withdrawn in an afternoon. And the woman who had staked her youth on it had no way to hold the man to it while it lasted, and no way to prove it once it was gone. Madeline Pollard had given 9 years and 2 children and her whole standing in the world in exchange for a sentence a man could unsay whenever he chose. That she got anything back at all, in the end, is the surprising part. The expected ending was silence, and she gave those years while believing, for most of them, that the price would eventually be honoured, that the man would keep his word and make her his wife, and lift her at last out of the shadow he had put her in. That belief is the cruelest part of the arrangement because it kept her compliant. A woman who thinks a promise will be kept does not run to the newspapers or the courts. She waits, and she keeps the secret, and she surrenders the children quietly, because to make a scene would be to destroy the very future she is waiting for. The promise did more than deceive her. It held her still for 9 years, a leash disguised as a future, while the children were born and lost. And then the colonel's wife did die, and the promise came due, and Madeline Pollard learned what a great man's word was worth. Breckinridge did not marry her. He married another woman, quietly, in secret, while Madeline still believed the promise to her stood. She discovered, as Mary Ann Sponsler had discovered a generation before, that the private assurance of a powerful man was a thing written on water, that all those years of a promise renewed had been renewed by a man who intended to keep it exactly as long as it cost him nothing and to break it the instant it was convenient. Her children were dead in unmarked institutional graves. Her youth was spent, and the marriage she had been promised had been given in secret to someone else. She was, by every rule the age had written for women in her position, finished. She was a ruined woman with dead, illegitimate children and no husband and no money, the kind of woman the machinery had processed 1,000 times and left in silence. What she was expected to do was disappear, as the children had disappeared. What she did instead was walk into a courtroom in the capital of the United States and put the Breckinridge name on trial. Chapter 7. A jury took 83 minutes. When Breckinridge broke his promise, Madeline Pollard did the one thing a ruined woman was never supposed to do. She sued. She brought an action for breach of promise of marriage, and she asked the court for $50,000. And in doing so, she reached for one of the only 2 weapons the law had left in a woman's hand. She could not indict him for what he had done to her youth or to her children, because the law recognized no crime in it. But she could stand before a jury and say that this man had promised to marry her and had broken that promise, and she could make him answer for it in public, and the public was the point. The suit was a machine for exposure, and exposure was the one force a Breckinridge could not command. That is the deep logic of the breach of promise suit, and it is why the law left it in a woman's hands when it left her so little else. She could not charge him with the years, or with the children, or with the ruin, because the age recognized no crime in any of it. What she could do was stand up in open court and say that this man had promised to marry her and had broken the promise, and demand that a jury put a price on the breaking. It was a blunt and a limited weapon, but it forced the private into the public, and once the private was public, a Breckinridge's greatest asset, the spotless name, became his greatest weakness, because the same newspapers that had built the name could take it apart, column by column. The trial opened in Washington on the 8th of March, 1894, and ran until the 14th of April, and it became a national sensation on a scale difficult to convey. It filled the front pages for weeks. It was argued in every parlor in the country, and its early current ran hard against Madeline Pollard, because the story the age preferred to tell was the story of the scheming woman, the adventuress who had set out to entrap a great man and now sought to profit from her own fall. The newspapers began there, painting her as the seductress and the blackmailer, the author of her own ruin come to extort a pillar of the Republic. And then the evidence came out, and the current turned. The dead children came out. The asylums came out. The 9 years that had begun when she was 17 came out. And as the country listened, the picture inverted itself. This was not a scheming adventuress bringing down a virtuous man. This was a girl of 17, taken up by a married man, many years her senior, used across 9 years, made to surrender his children to institutions where they died, promised marriage as the price of her silence, and then discarded in secret for another woman. The silver tongue that had made Breckinridge famous could not talk its way around the arithmetic of it. And when he took the stand in his own defense, he offered the country a sentence that has survived as a small, perfect monument to the double standard of his age. He said of himself and the 17-year-old he had met on the train that he was a man of passion and she was a woman of passion, and that there had been no seduction on either side. He meant it as exculpation. The jury heard it as confession. You can feel the room turn in that moment, across the distance of more than a century. Here was the silver-tongued orator, the man whose voice had swayed conventions and crowds and juries, reduced to defending himself by insisting that a girl of 17 had wanted her own ruin as much as he had. The eloquence that had carried him his whole life had nowhere left to go. The words, meant to spread the blame, instead gathered it all onto him, because the country doing the listening had by now heard about the asylums and the dead children and the secret marriage to another woman. And it measured the colonel's fine phrase against that record and found the phrase obscene. They were not out long. The jury that decided the fate of the Breckinridge name deliberated for 1 hour and 23 minutes, and it returned a verdict for Madeline Pollard, and it awarded her $15,000. Set that figure beside the salary of the congressman she had sued, which ran to about $5,000 a year, and you see the size of what the jury did. It handed a ruined woman 3 years of a congressman's pay. And more than that, it handed her the public verdict, the finding, read aloud in open court, that the great man had wronged her and owed her. The account she had been told would never be paid was paid in a courtroom before the whole country. The reckoning did not end with the money, because a Breckinridge dealt in something more valuable than money, and that was the name, and the name was what the verdict destroyed. The trial had made his private conduct a matter of national record, and the voters of his Kentucky district, who had returned him to Congress term after term, now had the account before them in full. when he stood for re-election, they answered it. He lost by 255 votes out of some 19,000 cast, a margin as thin as a knife and as final as a grave. William Campbell Preston Breckinridge, the silver-tongued colonel, grandson of Jefferson's Attorney General, heir to a century of American power, never held public office again. A 17-year-old he had met on a train, and the children he had left in asylums had ended a dynasty's hold on public life, not with money, which the family had in abundance, but with the one currency it could not replace, which was the name itself. The case did not vanish when the verdict was read. It survives, preserved in a published account of the trial, and revived by modern historians as one of the earliest and most complete records we have of a woman using the machinery of the courts to force a powerful man to answer for the children he had erased. The two children themselves did not survive. There is no monument to them but the verdict, which stands as their only memorial, a finding by 12 citizens that the account of their short lives had come due, and that the great name owed the bill. There is a further quiet meaning in the shape of her victory. Madeline Pollard did not get her children back, and no verdict could give them back, because they were already dead in unmarked ground before the trial ever began. What she got instead was recognition, the public and permanent acknowledgement that they had existed, that they had been fathered by the man she named, and that their brief lives and deaths were a wrong for which someone was accountable. In an age that had built an entire machinery to ensure that such children left no trace, a Washington jury made a record of these two that could never again be erased. It was a strange kind of monument, built of testimony and a verdict. But for children the world had tried to unwrite, it was the only monument they would ever have. Madeline Pollard avenged children who were already dead, and the vengeance cost a dynasty its place in public life. But avenging a lost child and recovering a living one are not the same act. The next child in this story was not dead, and not surrendered to any asylum, and not lost to any institution. The next child was alive and grown, and 4,000 miles away in England, and she was about to cross an ocean and do the thing none of the others had managed. She was going to come back, and she was going to take not $15,000, not half an estate, but every last dollar of the fortune that had tried to forget she existed. Chapter 8. The girl in Manchester had a lock of hair. 4,000 miles from the fortune that would one day be hers, Florence Blythe was being raised by relatives who could not tell her, plainly and in the open, who her father was. She lived in Manchester, in the industrial north of England, in the ordinary world of careful economies, a world about as far from a San Francisco mansion as it was possible to be, and still share a language. She was, in the bloodless language of the age, illegitimate, the daughter of a man and a woman who had never married, and in the England of her childhood, that word closed a great many doors. The word was illegitimate, and in the Victorian world, it was very nearly a sentence. A child born outside marriage carried the mark of it into school, into work, into every social encounter that mattered, and it was understood to close off, quietly and permanently, whole regions of ordinary life. Florence Blythe grew up under that mark, in an industrial city in the north of England, the daughter of a man she could not openly claim, and a mother whose own story the records keep only in fragments. She had, by every visible measure, been dealt the weakest hand this account contains. What she could not see, and what no one around her could see, was that the same absent father who had left her that mark had also, across the years, and without any fanfare, been assembling the proof that would one day overturn it. What she could not have known, as a girl in Manchester, was that on the far side of the world, her father was assembling one of the great fortunes of the American West, and that he was doing, quietly and at a distance, the one thing that would eventually place all of it in her hands. Her father was Thomas Henry Blythe. He had made himself rich in San Francisco in real estate and mining, in the churning speculative economy of California, and by the 1880s he was worth some $4 million, a sum that in the money of the present would run to something above $100 million. He had no wife in America and no legitimate family gathered around him. What he had was a daughter in England, born, by the accounts that would later fill the courts, to an Englishwoman reported to have been named Julia Perry. And what he did about that daughter, across the years and the ocean that separated them, is the reason this is a story of triumph rather than one more story of a child paid into silence. Blythe did not disown Florence, and he did not merely support her in secret while denying her to the world. He acknowledged her, in the small, persistent, private ways that a father can, and every one of those ways left a trace. He wrote to her, and the letters were kept. He sent photographs. He sent money for her keep, faithfully, across the years, a record of support that ran like a thread from San Francisco to Manchester and could later be followed backward by lawyers. He kept, among his own effects, the tokens a loving father keeps, and one of them, by the accounts that survive, would become the most famous keepsake in the long history of the estate that followed. It was a small curl of his daughter's hair, tied with thread, and on the label, in his own careful hand, he had written that it was a lock of his dear daughter's hair, kept for her papa. He kept the hair of a child he was not supposed to claim, and he labelled it in the language of open love, papa, and he kept it where it would be found. And then, in the months before he died, he did the decisive thing, the thing that separates Florence Blythe from every erased child in this account, who was left with nothing but grief and a grievance. He committed the acknowledgement to paper in a formal way. By the accounts that would be argued through the courts for years, in the February before his death, he executed acknowledgement papers, an instrument that set down in law what the letters and the lock of hair set down in sentiment, that this girl in Manchester was his child. He wrote the name into the record. He did, deliberately and in time, exactly what Murray Foley refused to do, and exactly what Isaac Singer buried under a false surname. He made his daughter, on paper, real. Why Thomas Blythe did this, when so many men of his kind did the opposite, the record does not fully explain. And it is not the narrator's place to invent a tender heart the evidence cannot prove. What the evidence shows is the conduct, and the conduct was consistent across years. He wrote, he paid, he kept the photographs and the curl of hair, he executed the acknowledgement. Whatever moved him, sentiment or duty or some private reckoning with his own mortality, the effect of it was to build, one document at a time, exactly the case his daughter would need. He may not have known he was assembling evidence. He may only have been a distant father doing the small things a distant father could. But the small things, taken together, were a fortune, and they were waiting in a drawer when he died. Weigh, for a moment, how little Florence Blythe had, and how much it would prove to be worth, because the gap between the two is the entire engine of what follows. As a girl in Manchester, she had no money and no power and no expectation of either. She had the lowest standing the age assigned, the standing of the illegitimate child of an absent man. She could not have hired a lawyer or crossed an ocean or commanded a single hour of anyone's attention. She had, in the world's eyes, almost nothing. But among that, almost nothing, there were a few sheets of paper and a curl of hair with a label, and those few objects carried inside them the one thing that outweighed a rich man's silence, which was a rich man's own admission, in his own hand, that the child was his. She held the name set down in ink. She simply did not yet know how much it was about to be worth. She did not know, because she did not yet know that her father was dead. Thomas Henry Blythe died suddenly in San Francisco on the 4th of April, 1883, at about the age of 60. He died the way the whole machinery of this story would have least wanted a rich man to die if it valued order, which is to say, he died without a valid will, and with no family gathered in America to take orderly possession of what he left. He left $4 million sitting in a legal vacuum, unclaimed, unassigned, with no clear hand reaching for it, and a whole continent full of hands that would. Somewhere in his effects lay the lock of hair and the label in his careful writing. 4,000 miles away, a girl went about an ordinary Manchester day, not knowing that her papa was dead, not knowing that she had just become, if she could only prove it, one of the wealthiest young women in California, and not knowing that between her and the fortune there now stood a gathering crowd of strangers, each of them preparing to swear that the money was theirs, and that the girl in England was no one at all. That crowd was already forming while she went about her Manchester day, and it is worth seeing it clearly, because it is the exact inverse of everything the earlier cases have shown. A living rich man spent money to drive claimants away from his fortune. A dead one, with no clear heir, drew them toward it, and the larger the fortune, the larger the crowd. $4 million, lying unassigned in San Francisco, was one of the largest such lures the American West had yet produced, and the people it drew would not be gentle with a teenage girl from England, whose only weapons were a few letters and a curl of hair. They would call her a fraud. They would put her birth on trial, and they would very nearly bury her a second time under the sheer weight of numbers before the truth of the paper could be heard. Chapter 9. 200 strangers claimed a dead man. Thomas Blythe died in the spring of 1883 without a will, and the vacuum he left behind filled, almost at once, with liars. This is the shadow that falls across every great unclaimed fortune, and it is the exact inverse of the erasing that runs through the rest of this account. Where a living rich man spent money to keep claimants away, a dead rich man's money drew them in, because a fortune with no clear heir is an open door, and through an open door will come everyone in the world with the nerve to walk through it. $4 million, sitting unassigned, was one of the largest such doors California had ever seen, and the crowd that gathered at it was enormous. By the time the claims were first counted, roughly 200 people had come forward to assert a right to the Blythe estate. They arrived with every kind of story. Some claimed to be cousins, or nephews, or long-lost relations of the dead man. And 3 of them, remarkably, were women who each came forward to swear that she had been his wife, his widow, entitled as such to the fortune. 3 separate widows, for a man who had died with no wife at all. It is worth holding that image beside the girl in Manchester, because it draws the whole moral of the estate in a single frame. Around the empty chair at the reading of Thomas Blythe's fortune, there gathered a crowd of adults, confident, coached, and false, 3 of them prepared to invent an entire marriage, and against all of them stood one real child who had never asked for any of it and did not yet know her father was dead. The 3 false widows deserve a moment on their own, because they show how brazen the reach for an unclaimed fortune could be. Not one, but 3 separate women came forward, each swearing under oath that she had been the wife of Thomas Blythe, each prepared to construct an entire marriage out of nothing to lay hands on his money. A man who had died with no wife at all had within months of his death 3 of them competing for his estate. If 3 strangers would invent a whole marriage for a share of the fortune, imagine what the rest of the crowd of 200 would invent, and imagine the odds against a real daughter 4,000 miles away being heard above that noise at all. The girl was brought to the fight. Lawyers acting on her behalf understood what she held: the letters, the support, the acknowledgement papers, the lock of hair. And they brought Florence from Manchester across the ocean to San Francisco, to the center of what would become one of the longest and most exhaustively documented estate battles in the history of California. She arrived a teenager, a girl from the English industrial North, set down in the raw gold rush wealth of the American West, to have her paternity, her right to her own father, argued over by strangers for years. The contest that unfolded was staggering in its scale. The field of claimants, first counted at around 200, was narrowed through the litigation to some 129. To resolve their competing claims, the court heard, by the detailed accounts of the case, 265 witnesses. It took in 139 depositions. It sat for 206 days of trial, and it recorded on the order of 653 hours of testimony. Fix those numbers in your mind, because they measure the thing precisely. It took 206 days in a courtroom, and 265 witnesses, and 129 competing liars and claimants to decide a question that a single lock of hair and a father's own handwriting had already answered. Hold those figures a moment longer, because the sheer machinery of the thing tells its own story about how the age treated a child like Florence. 206 days is the better part of a year spent entirely in a courtroom. 265 witnesses is a small town's worth of people summoned to testify about the birth and the blood of a single girl. 139 depositions, 653 hours of recorded testimony, and roughly 24 appeals still to come. All of that vast and costly apparatus was set in motion to answer one question: whether a rich man's daughter was his daughter, a question her own father had already answered in writing before he died. The law made her prove, across years and against an army, the one thing that should have been simplest of all, which was who her father was. For that, in the end, was what the whole vast machine was grinding toward. Underneath the 129 claimants and the 653 hours lay a simple contest between two kinds of proof. On one side stood the invented relations and the manufactured widows, with their stories and their coached witnesses and their confident performances. On the other side stood a girl who could show that the dead man had written to her, had paid for her keep, had kept a curl of her hair labelled in the language of open love, and had, in the months before he died, set his acknowledgement of her down in a formal instrument. It was performance against paper. It was the confident crowd against the acknowledgement on paper. And the name on paper, when the machinery finally finished its grinding, was going to win. But it had not won yet, and the waiting was its own kind of cruelty for the person at the centre of it. Florence Blythe spent a stretch of her youth as an exhibit, her legitimacy and her right to her own father dissected in open court by men who had every financial reason to prove her a fraud. The intimate facts of her birth, the identity of her mother, the conduct of her father, were entered into evidence and argued over and printed in the papers. She had crossed an ocean not to claim a fortune so much as to survive an inquisition into whether she had any right to exist in her father's eyes at all. The lock of hair that a fond man had labelled Papa was passed among lawyers as evidence. The private tokens of a father's love became the ammunition of a public war. There is a particular cruelty in what the trial did to those tokens. A letter written from a father to a distant child, full of the small, ordinary tenderness of such letters, was read aloud by lawyers and weighed for its evidentiary value. A photograph kept for love became an exhibit. The curl of hair that a fond man had tied with thread was passed from hand to hand in a courtroom, examined, argued over, its sentiment converted into proof. For Florence, the process must have been a strange second loss. To have the private evidence of the one bond she had with her father seized and turned into the instrument of a public fight over money. And yet it was also her salvation, because those same tokens, stripped of their tenderness and treated as cold proof, were exactly strong enough to win. She endured it because the alternative was to be one more erased child, one more entry in one more second ledger of names, and she had in her possession the one thing that could keep her from that fate. The crowd of 129 had numbers and nerve. Florence had the paper. And on a summer day in 1890, after all the witnesses and all the depositions and all the days in court, a judge in San Francisco was going to take that paper in his hand and rule that the girl from Manchester, the child the fortune had every reason to forget, was the only true heir of Thomas Henry Blythe. But that ruling was still years away from the day she first arrived, blinking, off the long passage from England into the glare of a San Francisco courtroom. In between lay the ordeal itself, the endless days of testimony, the parade of claimants, the lawyers picking at the circumstances of her birth, the newspapers printing every intimate detail of a scandal she had not chosen and could barely have understood. She had crossed an ocean not into an inheritance, but into an inquisition, and she would have to endure the whole of it, year upon year, before any judge would say aloud that she was who she had always been. Chapter 10. The lock of hair was worth $4 million. On the 1st of August, 1890, a judge in San Francisco ruled that the child no fortune had wanted was the only true heir. After the 206 days and the 265 witnesses, after the 3 false widows and the 129 claimants, the court found that Florence Blythe was the daughter and rightful heir of Thomas Henry Blythe, and that the $4 million was hers. The girl from Manchester, brought across an ocean to be picked apart, had won. And the thing that won it for her was the thing her father had done that none of the other fathers in this account would do. He had written her name down while he lived, and the writing spoke for her after he was dead. It would be a cleaner story if the ruling had ended it, but a fortune of $4 million does not surrender on a single day, and the crowd that had gathered at the open door did not disperse the moment the door was assigned. The verdict for Florence was the beginning of a second war, fought on the ground of appeals. The estate and the defeated claimants carried the fight upward through the courts, and Florence Blythe had to win and win and win again, across roughly 24 appeals over the years that followed, defending the ruling that had already declared her right. The cases entered the law books under her name, the long-running matters that lawyers would cite for decades. She did not merely inherit a fortune. She held it against a siege that ran on for years, and by the final accounting, with a last affirmance reported in the courts around 1905, the $4 million was, at last, and beyond appeal, hers. Weigh what that endurance actually required of her, because the winning was a war of years. To secure the verdict was only to begin. Every defeated claimant, every disappointed widow, every lawyer with a stake in the outcome had reason to appeal, and appeal they did, again and again, carrying the fight up through the courts across the better part of 2 decades. Florence Blythe had to win again and again, defending against each new challenge the finding that she was her father's child, until at last, with a final affirmance around the middle of the first decade of the new century, the fortune was hers past any further reach of the law. She had inherited a lawsuit as much as a fortune, and she outlasted it. And here, at the summit of the genuine cases in this account, the lock of hair completes its long transformation. Think of what that small curl had been at the start. It had been a keepsake, the most private and sentimental object imaginable, a father's tender token of a child he could not openly claim, tied with thread and labelled in the language of a love that had no legal standing at all. A lock of dear Florence's hair for her dear papa. It began life meaning nothing that the world was required to notice. A scrap of feeling between two people an ocean apart. And it ended as evidence in a court of law. One of the threads of proof that a father had acknowledged his child. And by that acknowledgement, it helped to move $4 million from a crowd of strangers into the hands of the girl the crowd had sworn was no one. The object did not change. Its meaning changed completely. Sentiment, at the last, became proof, and the proof was worth a fortune. That transformation is the quiet heart of the whole Blythe story. The very same object could be worthless and priceless at once, depending only on whether a name stood behind it. A lock of a child's hair is, in the market of the world, worth nothing at all. No one would buy it. It has no use. And yet this particular curl, because a particular man had written a particular name on its label and meant it, helped carry $4 million across an ocean and into the hands of a girl the world had counted as no one. The object never changed. What changed was that a court, at last, agreed to read the name as true. Everything in this account turns on that reading, on whether the world will agree to see a name as real. And Florence Blythe is the one case where it did, completely and forever. Florence Blythe did not fade back into the Manchester obscurity she had come from. She married a man named Fritz Hinckley in 1892 in the middle of the long fight, and she took her place among the wealthiest women in California, the fortune that had tried to forget her now, the foundation of her life. And the estate left a mark on the map that outlasted every claimant and every appeal, because land tied to the Blythe fortune, out in the valley of the Colorado River, grew into a town, and the town took the dead man's name. And to this day, there is a place called Blythe that carries into the present the name of the man whose forgotten daughter proved, against 129 liars, that she was his. It is a strange afterlife for the fortune, that its most permanent monument should be a town on the far edge of the California desert, a place of streets and houses and ordinary lives, carrying, without most of its residents ever knowing the story, the name of a man whose great achievement in the eyes of history was to have written down the name of his child. The mansions of the other fortunes in this account survive as museums or as rubble. The Blythe money survives as a town, and the town survives as a kind of accidental headstone, not for the millionaire, but for the acknowledgement he made. The small decision to set a daughter's name on paper that outlived him, outlived the 129, and outlived even the fortune itself. Weigh Florence Blythe against everyone who has come before her in this account, because she is the answer to all of them. The one time the machinery ran the other way. Isaac Singer's hidden children got shares of a fortune already divided, and one loyal son got $500 for his loyalty. Alice Hartley demanded the admission in a father's own hand, was refused it, killed for the refusal, and lost her claim when her child died. Madeline Pollard avenged children who were already dead and won a verdict, but not a fortune. And then came the girl from Manchester, who started with the least power of any of them, the illegitimate daughter of an absent man, 4,000 miles from the money, and who ended with the most, the whole $4 million, held against every appeal, because a father had once tied a curl of her hair with thread and written her name on the label. She is the proof of concept for the entire theme, the demonstration that the buried child, given one thing, the written name, could come back from the very edge of the world and take everything. And there is a last irony in her triumph, one that the darker cases to come will make plain. In winning so completely, in showing the whole country that a forgotten child could return and take $4 million against every claimant the law could produce, Florence Blythe made herself an inspiration to exactly the wrong people. The honest saw a wrong put right. The dishonest saw a business model. If a genuine lost heir could win a fortune with letters and a lock of hair, then a false one might hope to win a fortune with letters and a lock of hair that had been manufactured, and the only difference between the two, in a crowded courtroom years later, might come down to how good the forgery was. Her victory was clean. The lesson it taught was not clean at all, and the lesson travelled further than the victory ever did. Everything, up to this point, has been the story of a real child denied, and once a real child triumphant. Now the account turns, and it runs backward, because Florence Blythe had proved something dangerous to the world. She had proved that a secret child, if only she could establish the connection, was worth a fortune. And once a thing is known to be worth a fortune, there will always be someone prepared to counterfeit it. The next child in this story was not denied by a dynasty. The next child was manufactured to breach one, an infant obtained from the same shadow trade that had swallowed Madeline Pollard's children, and passed off as the heir of a founding father's line. Chapter 11. They bought a baby to seal a marriage. Robert Ray Hamilton carried the name of a founding father and an income most men could not dream of, and a woman used a borrowed baby to take both. He was a great-grandson of Alexander Hamilton, and the blood of the man on the $10 bill ran in him, along with a place near the top of New York society. He sat in the state assembly. He drew from the Ray family inheritance an income reported at around $40,000 a year, a sum that in the money of the present would run past $1 million, the kind of unearned yearly flood that made a man a permanent fixture of the class that mattered. He had, in short, exactly the two things the machinery of this age taught people were worth almost any risk to obtain: a great name and a great fortune. And a woman named Eva Mann set out to obtain both by inventing the one thing that could bind him to her: a child. This is where the account turns over and runs backward, and it is worth being precise about the inversion. In every case so far, a real child born to a rich man was denied, hidden, surrendered, or erased, and the fight was to make the connection real in the eyes of the law. Here there was no real child at all. Here a woman took the machinery of erasure and ran it in reverse. Instead of a fortune spending money to make a child disappear, a schemer spent effort to make a child appear, to manufacture an heir where nature had provided none, and to use that counterfeit heir to breach a dynasty from the outside. The same shadow trade that had swallowed Madeline Pollard's children whole could, in the right unscrupulous hands, be made to cough one back up to order. Eva Steele Mann, a woman of the demi-monde who moved under more than one name, presented to Robert Ray Hamilton a baby, an infant girl known as Beatrice and nicknamed Baby Beecher, and she presented that baby as the child she and Hamilton had made together. The child was not theirs. The child was not hers at all. It was a foundling, an infant obtained through the era's underground traffic in babies, the loose network of lying in homes and brokers and asylums that could, for a price and with no questions, place a child in a stranger's arms. It was the exact same current that ran beneath the Pollard tragedy, the machinery that took the children of the powerless and moved them around in silence. Only here it delivered a baby into a scheme, rather than out of one, an infant handed over to play the part of a Hamilton heir. There is a horror in the symmetry that is worth pausing on. The Pollard children had been fed into the foundling system to be erased, carried away from a great name and into anonymous institutions where they died. Now the same system, the same brokers, the same traffic in unwanted infants, ran in the opposite direction to serve Eva Mann, producing a child out of that anonymous supply and fitting it with a great name it had no claim to. A baby that belonged to no one could be made, for a price, to belong to a Hamilton. The machinery did not care which way it turned. It erased real children, and it manufactured false ones with the same indifference. Because to the brokers, a baby was neither a person nor an heir, but a commodity. And a commodity can be moved in any direction the money points. With the baby as her lever, Eva pressed Hamilton toward the thing she wanted, and on the 7th of January, 1889, she got it. They married. For a few short months, Eva Mann was Mrs. Robert Ray Hamilton, wife of a Hamilton, mistress of a Hamilton income, and mother, as the world was allowed to believe, of a Hamilton child. She had done, by fraud, what the dollar princesses of the age did by arrangement, and what ambitious women had always tried to do by charm. She had married into the name and the money, and the whole towering structure of her success rested on a foundation no more solid than a borrowed infant, a foundling with no true claim to anyone, dressed up as the heir to Alexander Hamilton's blood. For a few months, the imposture held, and it repays a moment to register how much it bought her while it did. Eva Mann was, in the eyes of the law and of society, Mrs. Robert Ray Hamilton. She had the name that reached back to the founding of the Republic. She had access to an income that ran to some $40,000 a year, a flood of unearned money that placed its holder permanently among the people who mattered. She had a husband, a household, and a child the world believed was a Hamilton. She had achieved, by fraud, the exact prize that the dollar princesses of the age pursued by careful arrangement, and that ambitious women had chased by charm since charm was invented: entry into a great name and a great fortune. And she had done it with a baby she had not born, obtained from strangers, a counterfeit heir at the center of a counterfeit marriage. Understand why the fraud was worth attempting, because the answer is the dark heart of this entire theme. A baby, in the ordinary run of things, is not a financial instrument, but a baby that could be made into a Hamilton heir was worth a fortune, because by the end of the 1880s, the culture had thoroughly absorbed the lesson that Florence Blythe had proved in a San Francisco courtroom, that a child with a claim on a great fortune was one of the most valuable things a person could be. Eva Mann did not invent that value. The Dynasties invented it, over decades, by paying so dearly to erase their real children that they advertised to anyone watching exactly how much a returning heir was worth. She simply read the advertisement and decided to counterfeit the product. The foundling in her arms was, to her, an entry she was forging into the second set of books, a false child written into a real fortune. It is the darkest expression of the theme, and the most exact. Every other case in this account has turned on a real connection that a fortune tried to deny. Here there was no connection at all, only the value that the denials themselves had created. The Dynasties had spent so lavishly, for so long, to bury their true children, that they had broadcast to every schemer in the country precisely how much a claim on a great fortune was worth. Eva Mann was not confused about biology. She knew the baby was a stranger's. She simply understood, as clearly as any lawyer, that a stranger's baby dressed as a Hamilton was worth a fortune, and she reached for it. And for a season, it worked, which is the most unsettling thing about it. The fraud was not caught by any vigilance of the family or any scruple of the law. It functioned. Eva Mann lived as a Hamilton, spent as a Hamilton, was received as a Hamilton, and the counterfeit heir slept in a Hamilton's nursery, and none of it was undone by the machinery that was supposed to protect the name. The scheme held for as long as Eva could hold herself together, which was the one thing she could not do, and it came apart in the end, not through detection, but through her own violence. The fraud undone by the temper of the woman who had built it rather than by any guardian of the fortune she had breached. But a fraud built on a living child is a fraud built on something that cries and moves and requires a nurse, and cannot be filed away like a forged letter, and the strain of maintaining it ran through the Hamilton household like a fault line. Eva Mann was volatile and violent, and the counterfeit family she had assembled was held together by nerve and by money and by the constant management of people who knew too much. It was going to come apart, and when it came apart in the most lurid way the age could imagine, with a blade in front of witnesses, in a scandal that would fill the New York papers for weeks and end with a Hamilton dead in a western river and his counterfeit widow reaching, even then, for the estate. Chapter 12. A stabbing, a drowning, and a widow's claim. The fraud held only until the day Eva Mann drew a blade across the child's nurse. It was August of 1889, some months into the marriage, and the violence that had always run under Eva's surface broke through it in an act that could not be hushed. She attacked the household nurse, the woman entangled in the daily management of baby Beecher, and she stabbed her, and the blood and the screaming and the police brought the whole carefully tended illusion into the open at once. Violence has a way of tearing through a paper fraud, and this one tore all at once. A stabbing could not be quietly settled or hushed with a payment. It brought officers and reporters and questions, and the questions ran straight to the foundation, to the child, and once anyone looked closely at the child, the whole edifice came down. The papers of New York, which had built entire editions on lesser scandals, fell on this one and did not let go, because it had everything the age craved: a founding father's descendant, a woman of the demi-monde, a fortune, a blade, and at the center of it, a baby that turned out to belong to no one at all. What had been a private arrangement became a public spectacle, and the New York newspapers, which lived for exactly this, fell on the Hamilton scandal and did not let go. Under the glare, the counterfeit came apart. The child that Eva had passed off as her own and Hamilton's was exposed for what it was: a foundling, an infant obtained through the baby trade and dressed in a Hamilton's name. The marriage that Eva had built on that child stood revealed as a fraud from its foundation. And Robert Ray Hamilton, the great-grandson of a founding father, found himself not the head of a young family, but the deceived victim of an elaborate confidence scheme, publicly humiliated, tied by law to a violent woman, and bound in the eyes of the world to a child that was no relation to him at all. In October of 1889, he did the only thing he could. He filed for divorce and set about trying to cut himself free of the whole manufactured tangle. Pause on the strangeness of his position, because it is the exact mirror image of every wronged woman in the earlier half of this account. Those women fought to prove a bond that a powerful man denied. Robert Ray Hamilton had to fight to deny a bond that a woman had manufactured. They struggled to write a true child into a fortune. He struggled to write a false one out. The same courts, the same law of marriage and legitimacy, the same machinery of proof. All of it turned now in reverse. A man of great name and greater income labouring to prove that the child in his own nursery was a stranger, and the marriage in his own name a lie. He never finished the work, because the next summer he died, and the manner of his death poured yet more sensation into a story already drowning in it. In August of 1890, Robert Ray Hamilton drowned, far from New York, in the rivers of Idaho, in the wild country of the American West, where he had gone to put distance between himself and the wreckage of his marriage. A Hamilton, descendant of the man who had shaped the finances of the young republic, dead in the water of a frontier river, thousands of miles from the drawing rooms of his class. The papers had the fraud, the stabbing, the foundling, and now the drowning, the full lurid arc of a great name brought low by a borrowed baby, and they ran every inch of it. The drowning gave the story its ending, and the ending had the shape of a moral, even if no one could quite say what the moral was. A Hamilton, of the blood of the man who had built the financial system of the young republic, dead in the cold water of an Idaho river, thousands of miles from the drawing rooms that were his birthright, his last months consumed by a fraud a woman had built around a stranger's child. The papers arranged the elements into tragedy and sold them by the 100,000. And still the story was not over, because a fraud reaching for a fortune does not stop reaching simply because the man at the center of it is dead. And here the theme completes its darkest circle, because even with Hamilton dead and the fraud exposed, the counterfeit family reached, one last time, for the real money. Eva Mann, whatever the truth of the child, was still arguably his legal wife, the divorce not yet final when he drowned. And so she turned, as the erased children of the genuine cases had turned, toward the estate. She moved to claim against the Hamilton fortune as his widow. The woman who had manufactured a child to seize a marriage now used the marriage to reach for the inheritance, the fabricated family closing its hand, at the very last, around the actual gold. Think of the nerve it took, and the logic of it, because the logic is the whole point. Eva Mann had built her claim on a lie about a child, and the lie about the child had collapsed in the most public way imaginable. And yet the marriage, whatever the truth of the baby, was legally real. The divorce not yet final when Hamilton drowned. And so she still held one true thread among all the false ones, the thread of being, in law, his wife. She took hold of that thread and pulled, reaching through a dead man's estate for the fortune she had schemed to marry. The counterfeit child had failed, but the counterfeit widow remained, and a widow, unlike a child, did not need a drop of the family's blood to make her claim. It is the exact gesture of every case in this account, the walk to the reading of the will and the demand to be paid, performed by a woman whose entire claim was a fraud, over a child who was a stranger, against a man dead in a river. Set Eva Mann beside Florence Blythe, because the age set them side by side, and the contrast is the whole meaning of the pair. Florence had a real father, a real acknowledgement, a real lock of hair, and she had to fight 129 liars to make the world honor what was true. Eva had no real child, no real bond, nothing but a borrowed infant and a talent for performance, and she very nearly wrote herself into a founding father's fortune on the strength of it. The same courts, the same estates, the same reach for the will, and running through both the same brutal lesson, that the connection between a child and a fortune had become so valuable that people would cross an ocean to prove a true one and would stab a nurse to protect a false one. That is the pivot of the whole account, drawn in a single line. The value was real, and the dynasties had created it. They had made the returning heir the most valuable thing a person could be, and having made it valuable, they could not then control who would try to become it. A true daughter would cross an ocean for it. A schemer would buy a baby and stab a nurse for it. And soon enough, when a great enough fortune fell open with no heir at all, they would come for it not in ones and twos, but in their thousands. The returning heir was now worth counterfeiting, and a thing that is worth counterfeiting once will, in time, be counterfeited by the thousand. That is the last turn of this story, and it is the strangest. One fabricated child had breached one dynasty, but within a generation, When the very last of a fantastically wealthy and reclusive family died and left a fortune with no heir at all, the counterfeit heir would arrive not one at a time, but in a flood, an entire army of manufactured children swarming a single estate, each of them swearing to be the secret child a great fortune had paid to erase. The machinery that began with Isaac Singer's genuinely hidden families was about to produce its final and most spectacular product, which was pure invention, forged in the thousands. A whole nation's worth of people claiming a dead recluse's name. Chapter 13. The last recluse died without an heir. When Ella Wendel died in 1931, she left $30 to $40 million, a sealed mansion on Fifth Avenue, and not a single direct heir. The Wendels had been, for generations, among the strangest of the great New York fortunes, not because of how they made their money, but because of how they lived with it. Their wealth lay in Manhattan real estate, in land bought and held and almost never sold, accumulated across the decades as the city grew up around it and multiplied its value many times over. They did not flaunt it. They hid inside it. The Wendels became famous for a reclusiveness so complete that it passed into the folklore of the city, the last of them living behind the drawn curtains of a great house on Fifth Avenue, while the modern metropolis roared past outside. To grasp the Wendel fortune, you have to grasp its strange first principle, which was never to sell. Generation after generation, the family bought Manhattan land and held it, refusing to part with a single valuable parcel, so that as the city exploded upward around them, their holdings multiplied in worth many times over without their lifting a hand. They lived frugally atop an ocean of wealth, famous for their thrift as much as their riches, a family that owned some of the most coveted ground on earth and behaved as though it could barely afford the heating. The seclusion deepened with each generation until the last of them had become almost mythical, wealthy beyond calculation, and visible to almost no one, their money as hidden from the world as any erased child in this account. The details of that seclusion have the quality of a fable, and they matter because they are what drew the flood that followed. The last Wendel women kept their enormous mansion on some of the most valuable land on earth, a corner where a commercial tower could have stood earning a fortune, and they refused to sell it or develop it or leave it. It was said that they kept a portion of that priceless ground as a private yard for a single pet dog, a patch of Manhattan worth a king's ransom given over to the comfort of one animal. Whether every detail of the legend is exact, the essence of it was true and widely known. A family of almost unimaginable wealth, living in deliberate isolation, sealed away, mysterious, their fortune as hidden from the world as the erased children of the earlier cases had been. The dog and the private yard became, in the telling, the emblem of the whole strange household. On a corner of Fifth Avenue, where a commercial tower could have stood earning a fortune every year, the last Wendel women were said to keep a patch of priceless ground open to the sky, a small garden for a single pet, an animal enjoying real estate worth more than most Americans would earn in 100 lifetimes. Whether every detail is exact, the essence was true and widely known, and it fixed the family in the public mind as a fortune sealed off from the ordinary world, a treasure behind a locked door, and a sealed treasure, when at last the lock is broken by death, draws exactly the crowd you would expect. And when the last of them died, that sealed and secretive fortune, with no clear heir to inherit it, became the largest open door this account has yet seen. Ella Virginia von Echzel Wendel died on the 13th of March, 1931, and she died as the last of her line, with no husband, no children, and no direct heir to step forward and take the estate. Behind her, she left a fortune reckoned at somewhere between $30 and $40 million, and by some accounts more. An ocean of Manhattan wealth, suddenly without an owner. Set the figures side by side with the Blythe estate to feel the change of scale. Thomas Blythe had died leaving $4 million, and 200 claimants had gathered at that door. Ella Wendel died leaving something between 30 and 40 million, by some accounts a great deal more, and she died as the very last of her line, with not even the memory of a nearby living family to give the crowd pause. The fortune was many times larger, the heir entirely absent, the household already a legend of secrecy. Every condition that had drawn 200 to the Blythe estate was present here, multiplied, and the crowd it drew was multiplied to match. Recall what happened around the $4 million of Thomas Blythe, how 200 claimants and 3 false widows gathered at that open door. Now multiply the fortune many times over, strip away even the memory of a living family, and imagine the crowd that gathered at this door instead. The crowd was one of the largest in the history of American inheritance. Estimates of the number of people who came forward to claim a piece of the Wendel millions run from around 1,800 to more than 2,300. Nearly 2,000 human beings, give or take, each stepping forward to swear a blood claim on the fortune of a dead recluse they had almost certainly never met. And a great many of them advanced the same claim, the claim that runs through this entire account, that they were the secret child, or the descendant of the secret child, the illegitimate son or hidden daughter that a Wendel had fathered and the family had buried. 2,000 secret children arriving at once, for a family famous chiefly for having no one. There is a leak of the uncanny in that image that the whole Wendel story carries, and it is worth letting it stand. A family had spent generations sealing itself away, refusing the world, keeping its wealth behind drawn curtains and its affections, so far as anyone could see, for a dog. And at the moment the last of them died, that sealed and childless fortune summoned to itself an army of phantom children, 2,000 strangers insisting on a blood tie to a family that had, in life, admitted almost no one at all. The house that had wanted no one was suddenly claimed by everyone. It is as strange a thing as this account contains, and it is entirely documented. And the strangeness ran deeper than the numbers, because the Wendel seclusion had a quality the newspapers could not resist and the claimants could exploit. A family that no one had really known, that had admitted almost no outsiders, that had left the ordinary marks of a public life largely unmade, was a family about whom almost anything could be alleged, because almost nothing could be quickly disproved. Secrecy, which the Wendels had used to guard their peace, became after death the very thing that made them open to invention. Where there are no witnesses and no open records, a forger has room to work, and 2,000 of them found room in the long silence the family had kept. Here the theme of this whole account arrives at its final and most revealing scale. The secret child had begun, with Isaac Singer, as a real and specific person, a boy under a false surname living a carriage ride from his father. It had travelled through Alice Hartley's dead son and Madeline Pollard's asylum children and Florence Blythe's ocean crossing, always attached to a real body, a real birth, a real grief. With Eva Mann, it detached from truth for the first time and became a thing that could be faked with a borrowed baby. And now, at the Wendel estate, it detached from any individual reality whatsoever and became a mass phenomenon, a role that 2,000 strangers at once believed they could step into, a story so deeply lodged in the American imagination that an entire crowd could arrive convinced, or pretending to be convinced, that a great and hidden fortune secretly owed each of them a name. The buried heir had become a national fantasy, and the man who chased that fantasy furthest, and forged it most brazenly, was a housepainter from Brooklyn, with a family Bible he had ruined to make himself a millionaire. Chapter 14. He forged a Bible to be an heir. Thomas Patrick Morris was a Brooklyn housepainter who decided he was the hidden son of a dead millionaire and set out to prove it with his own two hands. He was a man of about 52, a working man with a working man's income and no place at all in the world of Fifth Avenue mansions and Manhattan land. And when Ella Wendel died and the great heirless fortune stood open, he stepped into the oldest story of the age and cast himself as its hero. He would be the secret child. He would be the illegitimate son that a Wendel had fathered and the family had erased, come back at last to claim what was his. There was only one difficulty, which was that it was not true. And so Thomas Patrick Morris did what a man of the age did when the truth would not serve him. He manufactured it. The materials of his fraud were the very materials that had carried the genuine heirs to victory. The documents, the names set down in ink, the paper that says a child exists, and he set about forging them one by one. There is a grim education in his choice of forgeries, because he reached, unerringly, for exactly the kinds of proof that had carried the real heirs to victory. He did not try to argue his case with eloquence or appeals to sympathy. He understood, as everyone in this long story understood, that fortunes are won on documents, and so he set out to manufacture documents. A family Bible, because the family Bible had for centuries been the trusted register of a bloodline. A will, because a will was the instrument that moved fortunes. Even a likeness in bronze, to suggest the family face. He was building a counterfeit of the precise things Florence Blythe had possessed for real, the letters and the acknowledgement and the proof of blood, and he was betting that a good enough forgery of them would be worth as much as the genuine article. He produced a page from a family Bible bearing a record of marriage, the kind of domestic register that families had kept for centuries, and that courts treated as evidence of the truth of a bloodline. He produced a will, written on a flyleaf and dated to 1901, that made his claim. He produced even a bronze bust, said to resemble him, offered as a kind of physical testimony to the family likeness. He assembled, in short, a counterfeit of exactly the thing Florence Blythe had possessed for real, an acknowledgement on paper, the acknowledgement on paper, and he laid it before the court that would divide the Wendel millions. Against him, the estate set a lawyer named John Marshall Harlan, a man who would one day sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. And Harlan took the forgery apart piece by piece with the patient cruelty of a man dismantling a clock. The family Bible was the centerpiece, and the family Bible destroyed him because the publishers could establish that the blank leaf on which Morris had written his ancient marriage record came from a Bible that had not been manufactured until 1913. A record supposedly set down generations earlier had been written on paper that did not exist until the 20th century. The will was branded a bungling fraud, and Morris's account of his own life fell apart under the same scrutiny, for he had placed himself in intimate scenes with the Wendels on dates when the records showed him to have been working in a copper mine in Arizona, thousands of miles away, and he had described traveling in a private railway car that the Pullman company confirmed had not yet been built at the time he claimed to have ridden in it. Every prop he had built collapsed under the weight of a single question. When was this thing actually made? That question, so simple and so devastating, is the one the whole impostor age could never survive. A real acknowledgement carries its age in its paper and its ink, and the small, consistent facts of a life actually lived. A forgery has to counterfeit not only the document, but the entire world around it. The year the paper was milled, the movements of a man across a continent, the very existence of a railway car. And it is in those surrounding facts, and not in the forged signature itself, that the fraud always finally shows. Morris could forge a marriage record. He could not forge the date the Bible was manufactured, or unwork the months he had spent in an Arizona mine, or build a Pullman car years before its time. The truth of when things were made closed around his lies like a fist. The judge who presided over the Wendel estate, surrogate James Foley, delivered the verdict on the whole enterprise in 4 words that could stand as the epitaph of the entire impostor age. He dismissed the claim as false and a forgery. And Thomas Patrick Morris, who had reached for $30 million with a ruined Bible and a bust of his own face, went from would-be heir to a cell, jailed pending a grand jury investigation into his fraud. There is a terrible completion in that phrase, false and a forgery, because it names exactly what had become of the secret child by the 1930s. In the beginning, with Isaac Singer, the hidden children were real, every one of them the man's own blood under a false surname. By the end, the hidden child had become a thing, a Brooklyn housepainter forged onto modern paper and carried into court in the hope of $30 million. The same longing that had driven a real daughter across an ocean now drove a forger to ruin a Bible. And a judge met it with 4 cold words. The written proof that had once been an act of a father's love had become, in Morris's hands, the instrument of a swindle. And the court could see the difference, and it said so. The name on paper, which in the hands of Thomas Blythe had been an act of love that moved a fortune to a forgotten daughter, had in the hands of Thomas Morris become a thing manufactured from nothing, an ancient marriage forged onto modern paper, the sacred family record turned into the instrument of a lie. And Morris was only the most brazen of the roughly 2,000. Nearly all of that vast crowd of claimed Wendel children met the same end, defeated in court or quietly bought off, their claims exposed or abandoned, the great fortune passing at last, in the main, to charity and to the few distant relations whose connection could actually be proved. But the number is the thing to carry out of the Wendel estate, the 2,000, because it measures how completely the secret child had passed from fact into fantasy. When Isaac Singer died, the hidden children who gathered at his will were real, every one of them his own. When Ella Wendel died, the hidden children who gathered at hers numbered in the thousands and were, almost without exception, invented. In half a century, the buried heir had travelled the whole distance from a true and specific person to a mass delusion, a role that an entire nation of strangers believed it could step into and profit by. The dynasties had spent fortunes teaching the country that behind every great pile of money there was a buried child who was owed. By the 1930s, the country had learned the lesson so well that it produced the buried children itself, by the thousand, out of nothing but longing and forged paper. Follow the arc of it, from Singer to Wendel, because it is the whole story compressed into a single measure. When Isaac Singer died in 1875, the children who came to his will were real and numbered in the low dozens. When Ella Wendel died in 1931, the children who came to hers were almost entirely invented and numbered in the thousands. In the span of 2 long lifetimes, the secret child had travelled the entire distance from a specific living person to a mass delusion, from a boy under a false name to a role that a whole nation of strangers believed it could step into and profit by. That is what half a century of paying to erase real children had finally produced. A country convinced that a buried heir was owed and willing by the thousand to be him. Chapter 15. The machinery outlived the children. The asylums closed, the Silver Kings died, the mansions came down one by one, and the ledger of erased children stayed open. It is tempting, looking back across these 6 cases from the far side of a century, to file them as period pieces, curiosities of a vanished age of coverture and foundling homes and horse-drawn scandal. That would be a mistake, because the machinery that produced them was never really about horses or gaslight. It was about the two things that do not go out of date: money and the wish to control who is entitled to it. And those two things have outlived every asylum and every silver king in this account. The specific machinery has changed almost beyond recognition, and it helps to be precise about what has changed and what has not. The foundling asylums are gone. The lying in homes have closed. Coverture, the doctrine that folded a woman's identity into her husband's and left her so little of her own, has been dismantled piece by piece. A woman today owns her own property, brings her own suits, keeps her own name. The particular institutions that erased the children in these stories have all passed into history, and yet the function those institutions served, the quiet management of the inconvenient child of a powerful man, has never once wanted for new machinery, because the demand for it never went away. Look at what actually survives from these stories, and you find that it is rarely the people and almost always the apparatus. The Singer fortune survives, grand and diffuse, scattered into legitimate descendants and Paris salons, while the loyal son, who got $500, survives only as a line in a will. The Blythe money survives as a town on the Colorado River, while the girl who won it is a name in a law report. The Wendel land survives as some of the most valuable real estate on earth, while the 2,000 who claimed it survive as a number in a court record and a paragraph in the papers. The monuments endured. The people were erased, and then, in the strangest turn of all, the erasure itself became a monument, a permanent feature of how great fortunes and the law and the families beneath them actually work. And the apparatus that ran beneath all 6 cases is still, in its essentials, standing. The specific institutions are gone, the particular foundling asylums shuttered, the exact lying in homes closed, but the function they served has never wanted for new machinery. Money still buys silence around inconvenient children. Settlements are still signed, and confidentiality is still purchased, and the private arrangements that keep a powerful man's second family out of the newspapers are still, in their modern forms, a going concern. The confidentiality agreement is the lineal descendant of the false surname and the quiet settlement. It does the same work by gentler means, purchasing silence with money and enforcing it with law, drawing around a powerful man's second life the same protective circle that Isaac Singer drew with an alias and Murray Foley tried to draw with his refusal. The child at the center of such an arrangement is provided for, often generously, on the condition that the arrangement never be spoken of, which is to say that the child is acknowledged in private and erased in public, exactly as before. The mechanism has grown more humane. Its purpose has not changed at all. The admission in a father's own hand is still the hinge of it. Paternity is still contested in courtrooms, still turns on documents and proof and the imbalance of power between the person with the fortune and the person with the claim, even now that the proof can be drawn from a cheek swab rather than a lock of hair. The tools have modernized. The pattern has not moved an inch. What has changed most is the proof, and even there the change is smaller than it looks. In the world of these stories, paternity was a matter of documents and a father's word, and the whole tragedy of Alice Hartley turned on a single sheet that was never signed. Today, a cheek swab can settle in an afternoon what once took 206 days of trial and 653 hours of testimony to argue. But notice that the swab has not ended the fight. It has only moved it. The powerful still contest their obligations, still deploy their lawyers and their settlements, still work to keep a second family out of the newspapers. The science answers who the father is. It has never answered what the father owes, or whether the world will make him pay it, and those remain, as they were in 1890, questions of money and will and power. That is why these stories, for all the gaslight and the crinoline, do not feel like relics when you sit with them. Strip away the period detail, and the mechanism underneath is one a modern reader recognizes at once. A powerful person, an inconvenient child, a fortune, and the long, quiet effort to keep the second from ever touching the third. The names have changed, and the tools have changed, and the law has changed, and the essential collision has not, because it belongs to no single century. It belongs to wealth and desire, and the wish to control who inherits, and those are permanent, and so the ledger stays open. There is a temptation in drawing that line to the present, to reach for outrage or for easy lessons, and it should be resisted, because the cases themselves are more complicated and more human than any lesson. Alice Hartley killed a man. Eva Mann was a fraud and stabbed a nurse. Thomas Morris forged a Bible. These were not simple innocents, and the fortunes they fought were not always simple villains. That is the honest difficulty at the heart of these 6 stories, and it should not be smoothed away. This is not a gallery of spotless victims and cartoon villains. It is a gallery of human beings caught in a machine, and the machine did not care about their virtue. Isaac Singer's children were wronged, and some of them squabbled greedily over his millions. Madeline Pollard was wronged, and she was also, by the standards of her time, a fallen woman who sued for money. Alice Hartley was wronged, and she killed a man. The machine ground the innocent and the guilty alike, and what it reveals is not a moral about good and evil, but a mechanism about wealth and power, and the people, deserving and undeserving, whom that mechanism was built to erase. What binds the 6 is not a moral so much as a mechanism, the recurring collision between a fortune that wished to control its own bloodline and a child, real or invented, who insisted on being counted. That collision is not a relic. It is a permanent feature of the landscape wherever great wealth and human reproduction meet, which is to say, everywhere, always. So the ledger stays open, and the hidden ledger is never quite closed. And the question the 6 cases raise is not really a question about the past at all. It is the question of what a name is worth, and who gets to decide whether a child exists, and whether money can ever truly erase a person or only postpone the reckoning. To answer it, the account has to return to where it began, to a drawer in a dead man's house in San Francisco, and to the one child, out of all the thousands in this story, who held the truth in her hand and made the world honor it. Everything has been traveling toward her from the first sentence, and it is time to go back. Back across the years, back through the 2,000 forged claims, and the borrowed baby, and the dead senator, and the asylums, and the will read out to the alias children. Back to a quiet drawer in a house in San Francisco in the spring of 1883, and to the smallest and least valuable object in this entire account, waiting there to be found. Chapter 16. Only a few were telling the truth. Of all the thousands who claimed a dead man's name across those decades, only a handful were the child the fortune had actually buried. That is the hardest and the truest thing in this whole account, and it is where the story has been travelling all along. For every Florence Blythe, real and acknowledged and wronged, there were 3 false widows in her own case, and 129 claimants around her. And a generation later there were 2,000 Morrises around a single Wendel grave. The genuine buried child was always outnumbered, always surrounded, always in danger of being lost in the crowd of the invented. And that crowd was not an accident. The dynasties built it themselves. There is a mechanism in that, and it is the final turn of the argument. A dynasty that quietly acknowledged its children, that wrote their names in the open book and owned them before the world, would have created no myth and drawn no crowd. It was the erasing that did it. Every alias, every settlement, every child sent to an asylum was a small advertisement that a great fortune had something to hide and someone to bury, and the advertisements accumulated across decades into a national conviction that behind every marble facade there was indeed a buried child, waiting. The dynasties, laboring to keep their secrets, taught the whole country to believe in exactly the secret they were keeping. They manufactured the very belief that would one day send 2,000 strangers to a single grave. Look at what the great fortunes actually did. Across all 6 of these cases, set end to end. Isaac Singer built 5 families in the dark and priced a loyal son at $500. Murray Foley refused a dying demand to put a child's name in writing and was answered with a bullet. The Breckinridge name funneled 2 children into asylums where they died and then broke the promise that was their mother's only recompense. Thomas Blythe, alone among the fathers, wrote his daughter's name down, and the writing moved $4 million across an ocean and into her hands. And around the edges gathered the counterfeiters, Eva Mann with her borrowed baby, Thomas Morris with his forged Bible, feeding on the value the dynasties themselves had created. The fortunes paid and paid and paid to make certain children disappear, and every dollar they spent was an advertisement, printed for the whole country to read, that a buried child was worth a fortune. And so they taught a nation to believe in the returning heir. They taught it so thoroughly that the belief outran every real case and became something larger and stranger than any of the true stories that seeded it. They taught it until 2,000 strangers could gather at one grave, each certain, or pretending to be certain, that a great and hidden fortune secretly owed them a name and a place and a share. The dynasties had wanted, more than anything, to control who was entitled to their money. And in the end, they lost that control completely. Not to the courts and not to their real children, but to a national fantasy of their own making. The fantasy that somewhere behind the marble there is a buried child, and that the buried child is you. That is what the money bought them. They spent fortunes to erase a handful of real children, and they conjured, in exchange, a country full of imaginary ones. It is the great irony under all 6 of these stories, and it is a just one. The whole purpose of the erasing was control, the wish of a fortune to decide for itself who would be permitted to share in it. And the erasing destroyed that control utterly. It did not keep the money in the family. It summoned to the family's door an endless procession of claimants, real and false, and it made the private business of every great fortune into a public spectacle, argued in courtrooms and printed in newspapers, the exact opposite of the silence the money had been spent to buy. The dynasties reached for control and closed their hands on chaos, and the chaos was of their own making, and the chaos outlived them, which is the strangest inheritance of all. The mansions passed to other hands, or fell to the wreckers. The fortunes were divided or dispersed or given away. But the belief the dynasties had planted, that behind great wealth there is always a buried child who is owed, did not pass, or fall, or disperse. It settled into the culture and stayed there, a permanent suspicion attached to every great fortune, so that even now the death of the very rich summons the same question it summoned around Ella Wendel, the question of who else, unnamed and unacknowledged, might have a claim. The dynasties are gone. The doubt they taught the country to feel about them is not. But strip away the 2,000 and the 129, strip away the forged Bibles and the borrowed babies and the false widows, and at the bottom of it all there remains the small, hard fact the whole story rests on. Some of the children were real. Some of them were exactly who they said they were. And now and then, against the whole weight of the machinery, One of them came back and made the world admit it. You can picture her still if you let yourself. The girl in Manchester who did not yet know her father was dead, who had no money and no power, and nothing the world would call an inheritance. Nothing at all except a few letters in a careful hand and a small curl of her own hair tied with thread. Somewhere across an ocean, in a drawer in a dead man's house, that curl was waiting with its label, a lock of dear Florence's hair for her dear papa. It was the least valuable object imaginable, a scrap of a child's hair, and it was worth $4 million because a father had written a name beside it, and the name was true. Hold the two things together, because the whole meaning of these stories lives in the space between them. On one side, a fortune of $4 million, the kind of sum that built mansions and bought titles and moved the affairs of a state. On the other, a curl of a child's hair tied with a piece of thread, worth to anyone in the world precisely nothing. And the small, worthless thing commanded the enormous, valuable one, because a father had done the single, simplest, and rarest thing a father in these stories could do. He had written his daughter's name, and meant it. Everything the money could buy, the lawyers and the claimants and the years of appeals, broke against that one true sentence in a dead man's hand. That is the thesis under all 6 of these stories, and it is a stubborn and a human one. Money can strike a name from the record. Money can build a false surname over a child, or a foundling asylum around one, or a settlement between a fortune and its own past. Money can conjure 2,000 liars to a graveside and forge an ancient marriage onto modern paper. But money cannot make a true thing false, or a real child no one, however much it spends trying. The buried child, if the connection is real and the proof survives, can always come back and stand at the reading of the will and ask to be paid, and sometimes, against every claimant and every appeal, be paid in full. Behind every marble facade, there was a name that someone had paid to erase. And a few of those names, a precious few, refused to stay erased. Florence Blythe was one of them. She began with nothing the world would count, a girl in the industrial north with a mark against her name, and a father she could not claim. She ended with everything, the whole $4 million, held against 129 liars and 3 false widows and 24 appeals, because somewhere in a drawer there was a curl of her hair with a label in a careful hand, naming her as her father's own. The great fortunes of that gilded century paid everything they had to bury their children. And now and then, against all of it, a buried child kept the proof and came back and made the world admit her name. If you have stayed with me to the end of all 6, then let me leave you with one question, and I would truly love your answer below. If you had sat on that San Francisco jury, with a lock of hair and a father's handwriting on one side, and 129 confident claimants on the other, would you have believed the girl from Manchester? Tell me in the comments, and if these buried stories are the kind you want more of, subscribe, and I will keep bringing them back into the light.